Sorry?
The tooth is okay?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Yossi, and it's great to see all of you. I know a whole bunch of you, which is kind of nice, too. I'll try to do this for about a little less than an hour, so there's time for you guys to ask them questions as well. And, you know, these are not two deeply opposing forces here. It's not religious fanaticism versus communism. We're going to have two people who have not so different views, but I still think that there are nuances, and I do think that hearing them pursue them will be very useful for us. So I think I'm going to start with Mr. Lévy because he is, first of all, the guest, the true guest in the country today, and also because he's just essentially off the boat from Libya. He just went back to Libya and returned only, I believe, yesterday, and then flew here today, or flew here yesterday, and met also with the Prime Minister of Israel and brought a kind of message about the opposition. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that before we get going so that people know what you think you found in Libya.
Can I be completely Israeli with a lot of chutzpah and ask something else? Because I think that there is, if I may.
You want to talk about something else first?
Yes.
How did I know? That's fine.
We had a meeting before that, and I asked him a question. I get my own answer, but I think that maybe the audience would like to hear his.
No, that's okay. I think this is a topic that we should spend about 5 minutes on, and it's okay to do it first. Ms. Livni, please.
No, there was
it's up to Mr. Livni.
No, it's not related to the subject, but to the Strauss-Kahn scandal and something that Bernard-Henri Lévy said, and I think that maybe this can be an opportunity, because we had our own discussion on this, the opportunity to relate to this, if it's okay.
It's totally okay with me. We're all interested.
Okay.
So what is the question?
Yeah, exactly. What is your question?
No, it was published that you said something about, it looked like supporting Strauss-Kahn, not only personally, but the appearance was that...
It's okay. We'll do this for 5 minutes and then we'll move on. It's fine.
It's only a few seconds to clarify something that I know that a lot of people are interested in. What is your view about this situation, not personally, but not to have this perception that was for some of the Israelis that you support something which is completely wrong. So it's an opportunity to clarify the...
We'll do this and we'll move on. Mr. Lévy.
The question is that I supported something which is what? Supported what?
The appearance was that you support, I don't want to say support, but in your words, the appearance was that rape is something that, according to your view, is something which is, I don't want to say acceptable, but something that should be judged in a more...
Mrs. Minister, with all the respect I have...
You know something, I was asked before just a minute, I was asked before I came here this question. I met this Bernard-Henri Lévy before this. I asked him this question. He said something, there is a perception.
Okay, so
let's just do it.
Okay,
please.
Don't let's lose more. Don't let's lose time. Mrs. Minister,
it's not, I got the answer. But
I have too much respect for you not to reply to your question. I did fight all my life for the penalization of the rape. Rape for me is a crime. Attempt of rape is a crime. I pleaded for that in my youth for a long time, for this penalization. I did fight for so many women in my life who was raped, wherever, in Bosnia, in other countries, in forgotten wars which I covered for newspapers in Africa. I defended all my life the rights of, I tried to defend with my modest ways, of the offended women, the last one being Sakineh, this Iranian woman who was condemned to death, to death stoning for having allegedly had a lover and so on. So for me, there is no excuse, no compromise with that, with the rights of women and with the case of rape. What I said, which is very clear, in 2 articles which were published in Haaretz, is first one, that I believe in the presumption of innocence. Till a man or a woman is not proved to be guilty, he is innocent. Number 2, that in the case of Strauss-Kahn, who might be guilty, if he's proven to be guilty, he will have to be punished, and maybe even more heavily punished than if he was nobody, because he has to be exemplary, like me, like people who have a sort of moral of political charge. But let's imagine, which he says, that he is innocent. Let's imagine that 1 minute, after all, that he is innocent, which he is saying, in this case, he will have been victim of a preemptive punishment. George W. Bush invented the preemptive war strikes. We have now the preemptive punishment in the case if he happens to be innocent. The other thing which I said is that I replied to those who in America say, but how can you not endorse the party of the poor, immigrant, minority woman against the white, rich banker? And what I replied is that I believe in right. I believe in justice. I don't believe in justice according to the social class. In the past, there was a social justice, a class justice, which said the rich are always right. The bourgeois justice. The rich are always right. Poor are bastards. Are we going to reverse now the storytelling, saying the poor are necessarily right and the bankers, the rich, white, and so on are necessarily suspect? It is just a reversed class justice, which is not more acceptable than the other. So the only thing I say to this world popular tribunal, which is having its seat day and night since 2 weeks, judging, speaking this planetary gossip, this world rumor, I just tell them, please, shut up, be quiet, let the American justice judge, let the mechanism of the justice work, let the lawyer oppose their points of view, and we will see what happened really.
But didn't you also say that you believed he was innocent?
Of course. How can I say that I believe he is innocent? I said that Dominique Strauss-Kahn is a dear friend of mine. And his wife is an old friend also of mine. So I know them well. What I said, which is very different, is that the man whom I know, I cannot imagine him doing that.
Okay.
Now, I am aware enough of human condition to know that a lot of things may happen and that a man or a woman can act in a way which is unpredictable according to his or her moral code. Okay. I don't know. I did not say that. I'm not a judge. I'm not a cop, like all these journalists who sit as judge and cops instead of the real judge and cops.
By the way, I got the same answer. I thought that this audience deserves to hear these
That's
things.
fine.
That's all.
Okay, very good. I thank you very much for that. Because it was sort of the elephant in the room anyway, and Miss Livni very kindly took the elephant out of the room. So maybe you'll keep talking for a few minutes, Mr. Lévy, and tell us a little bit about what happened in Libya and what your impression is of the opposition there. And then I want to turn to Ms. Livni about the broader situation.
First of all, opposition for me and for an increasing number of countries is no longer opposition, but is the legitimate power in Libya. You have a lot of people, first of all the Libyan people himself, for whom it is no longer opposition, but the real legitimate representative of Libya. Kadhafi, according to most Libyans, lost the dignity and the right to govern his people. Not only recently, but probably since 42 years. What I saw in Libya, and at least in the last days, I was with my friend, the photographer and filmmaker Marc Roussel, who is here. We went in Misrata. Misrata is this besieged city, which is accessible only by sea, which is a martyr city, and where we were till day before yesterday. What I saw in 2 words, because I would like now to hear Mrs. Livni, what we see is two things, mainly, roughly speaking. Number one, the most destroyed city I saw in my life. The biggest and most savage urbicide, the killing of the spirit of a city, urbicide, which I ever saw. Probably worse than Sarajevo, probably more spectacular than Vukovar, to quote a few examples which I know. A city destroyed with a systematic way, with a barbarity, which really it is heartbreaking and leaves you breathless. Number one. The other thing we saw is a resistance, an example of resistance, of dignity, of courage, and of heroism, which is, I think, unprecedented in modern history. Generally, when you have a city which is occupied by tanks, by heavy forces, they liberate themselves when you have an armed column which arrived from outside. Paris was liberated by the Deuxième DB and by the freedom fighters of inside, but you had also a column from outside. In Misrata, you have this incredible example of a city which liberated itself with nearly bare hands, with the citizens themselves, building some fortune weapons, making them out of pieces of iron and so on, and pushing the tanks out of the city with a very heavy price of blood. It costed a lot, 1,300 dead probably, 6,000 injured. The last day when we were there, in the very day, 80 injured, close to death, people coming from the front line of Defna and Abdul Rauf. So this example of courage, a city liberating itself nearly without any external support.
We're here to talk about the Arab Spring in Israel, and one of the things that you heard from the opposition leaders, if I understand correctly, relates to Israel. Can you talk to us for a minute about that?
One thing which I heard, yes, the thing which I heard during my various journeys and stays in Libya is that I heard you spoke about clash of civilization. My belief since long is that the only real clash of civilization which we faced at the end of the 20th century and in the first 10 years of this one is a clash inside Islam, dividing Islam between moderate Islam, enlightened, moderate, compatible with democracy, and the fundamentalist, terrorist, fanatic, fascist Islam. For me, according to my observations, this was and is the real clash of civilization. My impression is that a big part, let's say, of this opposition in Libya, and most of the leaders of it, which I really, I spent days and nights with the core of it, and I tried to scan them, are on the good side of this clash. They are faithful worshippers, and not always worshippers, by the way, of an Islam which is moderate, which is not fanatic, which is open to the Western world, and which has toward Israel no hostility.
So that's an interesting surprise.
This is an
No
interesting
hostility
surprise,
to Israel.
and this is a message which I delivered. I came for Mrs. Livni, and I came for our meeting of today. But I took the occasion of that, happening to be in Israel, to deliver to Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning a message of the head of the National Council of Transition, which is the head of the power in Benghazi, in Tobruk, in Derna, and in Misrata, saying a few things which have not to leak today. Among them, this, that the future power in Libya, when Kadhafi will be out, will be open to all democracies in the world, including Israel, will be trying or militating in favor of a situation, an agreement in the area which will be based on equality, justice for every parties, and every parties, which means Palestinians and Israel, and security for the existing states.
I'm going to just stop you and turn now to Ms. Livni, because, I mean, it's the very encouraging message for the people in this room. But on the other hand, over the last 4 months, what's happened in Egypt and in Tunisia and in Yemen, and what may be happening in Jordan, and what is happening broadly in the region, does not suggest to me, and that's what I want to hear from you, a general love of the idea of welcoming Israel into the family of nations.
I completely agree with what was said about the clash of civilization that is now amongst the societies themselves, like in Egypt, Libya, and other places. And in the end, we don't know who's going to win, whether these are these young people that took the streets, and for them, maybe Israel represents the same values that they are fighting for. They are fighting in order to get freedom, better economy, better life for themselves. So maybe for them, or hopefully for them, Israel is not the enemy. And it is clear to me that in this battle between extremists and moderates, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the reason for this extremism, but yet it is being abused by the extremists in order to get more support, in order to provoke, in order to get more support from radical elements. So I hope that Israel is not going to remain the sole democracy in the region. Well, it's nice to be the only democracy, but we would like to live between democracies, because I believe that peace needs to be made not only between leaders, but also between peoples, and this is something that can happen only in democracies.
But even if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the cause, I actually think it's one of the few things that the two people fighting rather agree on, which is hostility to Israel. It's very interesting to hear about the leader of the council in Libya, but it's not the case, I don't think, elsewhere. Do you?
I truly believe that it's the Israeli interest to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not in order to get the moderate supporting us, because this is our own interest and the only way to preserve the values of the State of Israel as homeland of the Jewish people and the democracy. So this is our own interest. It is also clear that when these young people took the streets and demonstrated, Israel was not on the agenda, but yet today in Egypt, even though when they started demonstrating in Tahrir Square, Israeli flags were not there, but each and every Friday, you can see thousands and thousands of people demonstrating against Israel in the neighborhood of the Israeli embassy in Cairo.
That's right.
So things can change. And since I believe that we need to solve the conflict anyway, it is clear to me that they abuse the conflict, but I don't want to give them this excuse to get more and more support from these extremist and radical elements. So,
in other words, you're saying it will work, it will be great for our relations, but that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because we need to do it, we Israel.
And since I believe that this is our own interest, the sooner the better, because I know that there are those saying, okay, we have this uncertainty in the street, so let's wait and do nothing. And I believe that this is against the Israeli interest.
So,
because I don't want the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be on the agenda in future elections in Egypt, Libya, or I don't know what's going to happen in Syria and elsewhere.
Okay, so now here's another question for both of you, and actually I think I'd still like to start with you if you don't mind, which is that today in Haaretz, Ari Shavit wrote something which I thought hit an important target. He said, with the Arab Spring, as a result of the Arab Spring, Palestinians will not actually ever give up the right of return, or will they sit with Bibi Netanyahu, or will they sit with you, was what he was saying. I mean, it's over. The Arab Spring has actually created a different sentiment among Palestinians and among Arabs, which is more rejectionist of Israel and emboldens the more, from an Israeli perspective, hard agenda. Do you think that's true?
Well, I don't want to refer from obvious reasons to Ari Shavit, but
it's a small country.
It's an internal joke. But
Good point. I didn't even think about that.
But yet, the most important thing is to understand that I understand, and according to my experience from the negotiations with the Palestinians and with the Arab world and the Arab League, it is clear that any Palestinian leader who wants to end the conflict with Israel needs to get the support of the Arab world, because there are some concessions and compromises, as any Israeli leader needs to take some risks and to make the compromises and the concessions that are needed in order to reach an agreement and to end the conflict. So when there are some changes now in the Arab world, for example, it was clear to everybody that Mubarak was the supporter of the historical reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians. Now he's not there. Nobody knows who's coming next. So there is some question marks about the ability of the Palestinian leadership to make an agreement with Israel without the support of strong leadership on the Arab world. But this is the pessimistic point of view. The optimistic one is that there were some strong leaders in the Arab world that were completely against it, that they didn't support any compromise on the right of return or other compromises that are needed in order to end the conflict. So in the end, the decisions that need to be made are by the peoples or by the leaders, both sides, Israel and the Palestinians. And since I live here, I cannot be optimistic, but yet we cannot afford to look just at the pessimistic point of view.
Okay.
And I think that peace with the Palestinians, meaning maybe an agreement with the Palestinians at first, that part of the agreement is ending the claims, or the end of claims against, national claims against Israel, is possible. And I said before, the sooner the better, because religious conflicts are unsolvable, and we cannot afford to have this conflict turn into a religious one, something that Hamas or other extremists in the region can do in the future.
So, Mr. Lévy, I know that you've heard these encouraging things from Israel's perspective. In Libya, I don't know if you've been talking to other Arab leaders or Arab youths, but as I say, I think there is something to the idea, and I want to hear your response, that the Arab world's uprising and spring, if you like, has actually hardened the Palestinian view of Israel.
Maybe. I don't know. About the right of, the so-called right of return, as far as I know, it does not, it is not born with the Arab Springs.
Born it was not. For sure not born.
For sure it was not. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, since 60 years you have this right of return. So if you want to make the guilt on the Arab Spring...
No, I'm not trying to make it the guilt.
Okay,
I'm just saying it may make it harder rather than easier.
I don't think so.
Okay.
It is not my impression.
Okay.
My impression is that anyway, this right to return will be opposed only by a firm, steady political will of Israel, of the friends of Israel, and of the reasonable people all around the world. I hope that we will have a majority of reasonable people in the world who will say to the Palestinians, when the moment will come, it is great to have two states, one state which is Israel, another one which is Palestine. You cannot have two Palestines. Okay? This is a reasonable point of view.
Now, you also were, a month or two ago, complained about the way Israel was publicly perceived in its attitude toward the Arab Spring. You were saying, you know, it's the only democracy and it ought to be welcoming other democracies rather than talking about the devil we know and so on.
Yes, but there is another thing I wanted to say. Is that one thing which happens since a few months and which seems to me rather important and remarkable for us is that for the first time since the Tunisian event, the Arab world, if the Arab world discovers something, it is the following. They discover that they have an enemy who might not be Israel. Since 60 years, whatever problem happened, economic problem, financial crisis, poverty, corruption, whatever, it was the fault of Israel. Always. Israel was guilty of all the sins and the plagues of Egypt and of the rest of the Arab world. For the first time, there has been a sort of revelation, of unveiling of the reality. The young Egyptians, as far as I know, not a lot. The young Tunisian, I don't know a lot either. The young Libyan, I know more. Discovered, understood, realized that they had an enemy much more fierce, terrible, violent, wanting their death, which was their own leaders. And this is a great discovery, I can tell you. And I heard that so many times in all Libyan cities I went through.
I believe you.
I don't tell you that they fell in love with Israel. I don't tell you that they don't believe that the Palestinians have the right to a state. This is something else. But they discovered that they have been cheated by a world propaganda organized by Kadhafi, organized by Hafez al-Assad and his son, organized also by Mubarak. Mubarak, of course, was a tenant of the peace treaty. This is probably his historical merit. But don't forget that during the same years, you had his culture minister, Farouk Hosni, saying that if he found a book written in Hebrew in the Library of Alexandria, which is the world library, the library itself, of all languages, he would burn it.
Right.
He had a minister who wanted to burn Hebrew books. You had in the bookstores of Cairo and Alexandria the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, Mein Kampf, in free sale.
But I don't think it's being cleared out. I don't think the bookstores are being cleared out of that. In other words, I think you're right that the people have learned that the source of their trouble is not Israel.
This is the point.
But it has, they've also learned, and then I'll turn to you, that they've also learned, I think that what they really learned is it's not only Israel. And that's not the same as it's not actually Israel. But go ahead.
I think that we need to change our perception and the way we see the region.
Okay.
Because as was said, and we agree that there is a clash of civilization now among society. Now, we need to make new camps in the region and in the entire world, as we did in the past, but now it's changing. The extremists versus moderates or pragmatics, good guys, bad guys, and so on. Israel needs to be, and Israel by definition is part of the free world and part of the camp of moderates. Now each and every state and every society need to decide where they are. And when they are, and when they choose to be part of the free world, to be a democracy, to join, they are joining us. So what Israel needs to do now is to recruit the world, not only the Arab world, but also the international community, the United States, Europe, and to make them understand what our values are, how would we like to promote the idea of two states for two peoples, not as a favor to them, but as our own interest. And then we can, when we see the results in the Arab world, if hopefully we see this opposition in Libya taking the state and making their own decision, so for them Israel can be, or they can join the camp that Israel is part of.
So there, I think now that's your challenge, because I think that what Arabs in the street in the region feel is that what they now have is the potential to be free Arabs, and to be free Arabs, Palestinians cannot be. And the reason they cannot be it is because of Israel. That's how that's how people feel. And so therefore the challenge to Israel is to get out of the way of the people who want to be free. I mean, that's at least how they see it. So the question is, in a certain way, earlier you said that what's important is that Israel needs to solve this problem for itself, not because... On the other hand, the truth is that the boiling of the region does add urgency to Israel's task,
this
right?
Is my position.
You agree? You don't... So, okay, because those are the two...
This is my...
One is, we got to wait.
I believe that stagnation doesn't serve our interest. I believe that there is no status quo. I believe that status quo with the Palestinians means that there is no status quo with the world, and on the relations between... And this affects status quo with the Palestinians, affects the perception of Israel and the relations between Israel and the entire international community. So since it is our own interest anyway, the sooner the better. But there is one thing that the international community can do in order to shape the future in these places. And I tried to preach for this in the past. There is an opportunity now to have a universal code for elections, assuming that next week President Obama made another speech, not about Israel, not about the Arab world, about democracy, saying, as he said in Cairo, democracy is more than elections, and saying that democracy is not just voting, but it is about values. And each and every party who wants to participate in elections need to accept certain values. The monopoly on use of force by the government, because we cannot see another armed militia like Hezbollah in Lebanon that also participates in elections. And not using force in order to promote their own agenda, and adherence to former agreements that their state signed. Right. And this relates also to former agreements between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and Egypt. Now, it's not against anybody. It's for democracy, and this applies to everybody. And by the way, in Israel, in 1988, our Supreme Court denied the right of a racist party, qu'a, to participate in elections, because being racist is against democratic values. So having something like this can shape a bit the future and can put some parameters for those extremist and radical elements. If they want to be part of this process, they are more than welcome. But if they want to abuse it, exploit it in order to act against the democratic values, so there are some parameters.
No, there was a blog that I saw that complained about you, Mr. Lévy, that you believed in freedom for Arabs everywhere except in Palestine. Now, I know that that's a distortion of your views, but the complainer was saying you seem so focused on helping Israel and then helping Arabs elsewhere. What about the Palestinians? So, do you want to speak for a minute about that issue?
My stand about Palestinians is the same since 40 years. I'm in favor of a two-state solutions with guaranteed security to Israel and so on. This people can distort however they want.
Yes, they can.
I never move from that. What I believe also is that the Palestinian state cannot be based on fascist values, or cannot be ruled by a party which belongs to the history of world fascism, as Hamas is, like Hezbollah. For me, the problem of Hamas, again, clash of civilization, is not Islam. The problem of Hamas is Muslim Brothers, which is a party born in the 20s under the shadow of the rising Nazism in Germany, and so on, and that they never made the mourning of this history, they never made the self-criticizing of that, and this reflects in their chart, which has all the articles, you know. So, a Palestinian state based not only on free elections, but on values, as Barack Obama said, which is the real meaning of democracy, according not only to Obama, but according to Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and John Locke. Democracy is both. It is elections, but also faithfulness, fidelity to a law, a stock of principles which are the rules of the rule. This I am in favor of course. Now, about the Arab Spring in general, what I would say, I said that it has this virtue to have shown to the Arab world that they have another enemy, that Israel. This is one point. The other point is that we are not only spectators of the movement. There is not Israel, France, the free world, seeing how they act, taking trying to measure their ability to reach the democratic goals and so on. We have also a power on that. We have a power to improve them. We have a power to help. We have a power to encourage. We have also this duty. And especially for those who rely on this old history, which is the Jewish history, which is not any history, based on value, on a certain sense of universalism and so on, we have a moral duty, which is not only to look at and to watch and to judge and to give good points and bad points, bonus and malus, but which is to try to help these people to go in the right direction. Two solutions. They will reach the bad point. The democracy will liberate dark forces. The Muslim brothers will take the power. Then we will say, we tried with optimism and anxiety, with optimism and skepticism. We failed, but we tried. We gave a chance to democracy. We gave a chance. Or the goal, the end of the story will be like in Eastern Europe. It was not so easy, by the way. A real few steps toward democracy, a real diminishing of the power of Muslim brothers and so on, and we have to be, I think it is worth being part of this process. But the idea of saying from the beginning to freeze ourselves, to keep stiff, to say, let's look, but we are sure that it will end badly, it is contrary to the Jewish values, it is contrary to the interests of Israel, and it is not only pessimistic, it is just no politics.
Okay.
If Israel is really the moral and politic power it is, it has to be active in this process.
I completely agree.
So let's then go a little closer to the earth and try to figure out together what should happen in the next few months, because the PA has cut a deal with Hamas, which is something I know that Ms. Livni is not very enthusiastic about. She's never been a big fan of Hamas, nor have you, I don't think. And yet, here we have the unity deal in formation. We have the Palestinian Authority feeling, I think, more confident than ever that it has international support for its point of view and is thinking of going to the United Nations. And these things are not likely to encourage a deal soon, I think, or perhaps they will. I mean, that's what I'd like to hear. So let's start with you, Ms. Livni. What do you think Israel should be doing now in this situation that it's not doing? Because it's, no, I'm going to start with she actually has something, I'm sure, to say about this, not that you don't. But I mean, what I want to ask you is that because it's not, I mean, the Palestinians have said we want a freeze of 2 to 3 months and 67 lines as the basis. Do you think that Israel should say yes to those things?
I believe that Israel should initiate it, not to be in a position of yes or no. And this is something that we did in the past and can be done today. And the future Palestine, we have this agreement between Hamas and Fatah. It's not, well, it was the understatement of the year, saying that I'm not, that Hamas is a problem. No, by the way, there is no hope for peace with Hamas because they express the same religious ideology which cannot accept our right to exist. But it's not about Hamas. It's about the possibility to reach an agreement with any Palestinian government that accepts the requirement of the quartet. So what needs to be judged, we have this agreement. It's not too late because now they are forming their government. And I think that if and when Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen understands that there is hope for peace, not only through declaration of the United States, the United Nations, but in the negotiations room, I think that he would act or take the measures that the future Palestinian government would accept the requirements of the Quartet, saying that Israel has the right to exist, renounce violence, and accepting former agreements between Israel and the PLO.
Well, what should Israel do to get the negotiations started?
And I believe that what is needed now, that was in the past, and it's needed now, is trust. There is no trust between the parties. And this is the reason that, unfortunately, this government, which my government, that I don't support, but yet it's about Israel and the Israeli interest, they need to prove that they are serious enough to enter the negotiations.
But these are general statements. How? How?
No,
how? If you were in his shoes, in his office, what would you do differently?
I would have been in the negotiations room now. After the elections, the
because
negotiations would not have stopped. We negotiated.
Right.
It can be continued. It should be continued. And I believe that now the problem is the problem between this Israeli prime minister and this Palestinian leadership. And I know that we built the trust not because I gave them everything that they wanted, but because they trusted me to fight for the interest of Israel, but yet to reach an agreement at the end of the day that represent the idea of two states for two peoples. And it's not about what we say, it's about the real intention of doing so. So I think that right now Israel needs to initiate and to act in a way to tempt or to give the Palestinians the understanding that the United Nations is their worst case scenario and not their best option.
And so what are you going to offer them to make them see it that way?
As I said before, I am not basically free of settlements. I think that it's a small price in terms of the idea of ending.
So you're okay with that?
I was okay with that when the Israeli Prime Minister asked to freeze settlements for 2 or 3 months in the past. I initiated a discussion with him, an offer, which I said to him that if this is the only thing which is needed in order to relaunch negotiation, so they didn't ask us to do so, but yet if this is needed and the President of the United States asks you to do so, so it's not a price because at the end of the day, for all of us who understand that the idea is two states for two peoples, that we need to define the future border in accordance to the realities of the ground, on the ground that are there.
Yes.
For me, even sending young people to live...
Are you comfortable with 67 plus swaps as a basis?
There is no need to do it.
Well, they're now asking for it.
They're asking for it. We are asking for it.
And the President is also asking for it.
When Israel is being active, Israel can put on the table, not in a press conference, but in a closed room with the President of the United States and to say the following. Our interest is to end the conflict. The idea of just negotiating border and security, maybe it's easier, but yet it doesn't represent the idea of ending the conflict. We need to put everything on the table. We need the American support of having the American support on Israel's security, the future borders that relates to the settlements. Because they are there, it's not important what do you think about this idea, whether it's part of the Jewish people coming back to the homeland of our forefathers, something which is against the international law, and having also the American understanding that at the end of the day, the end of conflict is going to be not 67 line, but based on the 67 territory. When the United States is with you on this, it's going to be more productive to relaunch negotiations and have the Palestinians in the room. It is true that I was not asked to do so because they trusted me.
Right.
So I believe that, unfortunately, this government needs to pay more, and unfortunately, it relates to the Israeli interest because there is a difference between the terms of reference to begin with and the end of conflict.
And, Mr. Lévy, do you have a view of what Israel should be doing as September looms and the possibility of either a Security Council or General Assembly resolution being out there threatens Israel's maneuverability?
First of all, I believe, like Mrs. Livni, that the Hamas-Fatah agreement is a big mistake of Mahmoud Abbas. Israel made mistakes. Netanyahu probably made mistakes. It's very difficult for me to say that in this country where I am hosted, but you know, some of you know that I'm not completely wrong. But Mahmoud Abbas made a huge mistake by this alliance with Hamas. And not because it is a religious party. Problem of Hamas, again, is not religious, but politic. The problem is politics.
Their ideology is the problem.
Right.
This way or the other.
Which means politics. A Jew will have seldom a real life-to-death problem with a Muslim who is just Muslim. The problem begins when the Muslim matches...
Bernard, so I would like to make it clear. I don't think that this is because they are religious, but because they express extreme religious ideology, which is not willing to accept our existence here.
And not only extremists, but again, when you look at history, it is a fact, it is not a slogan. The context, which is the context of Hamas, you have a little context, which is the context of the situation, and you have a grand context, which is the history of fascism in Europe and the Arab world since the 20s. So with this party, it's really difficult. It does not ease the peace.
But it's happening.
First consideration. Second consideration, history is fasting, is getting, there is a state of emergency now. It's speeding. History is speeding because of September, because nothing is completely steady in the world. America is, thanks God, a strong ally, and more than a strong ally, a blessed ally of Israel. But it is not written that it will last for ages and ages. Nobody knows. There is so many things which we believed, we human beings of this epoch, to last forever, which didn't last forever. So we can imagine an America one day, a Europe one day, Europe being even less favorable to Israel, and an America beginning to ask to itself questions about Israel, why Israel, and so on, why this place of Israel in the American policy and so on. I was stricken 2 years ago by the success in America of a book, the book of Meyer Shammer and Wald, who was a real event saying just that. At the end of the day, why Israel? Why should this little country have such a place, such a role in the politics of America? You can have that. You can have some movements in America in some minority groups, but who are now less and less minority, who will ask the same questions. These sort of ideologies which we have in Europe, denial of Holocaust and so on, they exist also in Israel, in America, and sometimes stronger than in Europe, and so on. So
but I want to know where you think
there is an emergency. There is an emergency. What I think with humility and modesty should be done today. You have two patterns of peacemaking in two possible patterns. Okay. You had one pattern who proved to be great and which failed, which is the Oslo pattern.
Okay.
Little steps, process, step by step, becoming friends more and more, and at the end of the process, peace. This happened to fail at the end of the day. Barak was the last, Ehud Barak, the present Minister of Defense, was the last witness, actor of this process. It failed. You may have another process, which I called a few years ago in this university, when I was given a doctoral honoris causa, dry peace, dry, la paix sèche, dry agreement. Not process and peace,
all at once.
Love and peace, but peace and love after.
I completely agree.
Peace, all of a sudden, peace as a package, peace without sentiment, peace without.
But you have to sit down to do it.
Without lyrism, without feelings and so on. Peace first. So I would dream of Tzipi Livni being Prime Minister, or why not the current Prime Minister, because we can always be surprised. It is not forbidden to be surprised by the politicians. The Prime Minister of Israel standing before September, of course, in an international stage, I don't know which one, giving a clear vision clear means having a real shape, able to be envisioned, imagined by the public opinion all over the world and by the Arab world of what peace means, this is my offer. Frankly, if you ask to an average citizen in Oklahoma or in Arizona or in Europe, not to speak with the Arab world, what is exactly the idea of the peace which the current Israeli leaders have, they will not know. It became so complicated, borders, swatch, answer, splash, impossible to do. So a prime minister standing with a positive tone, with a real hope, with a real optimism in the future and saying, this is my offer. Maybe I would not discuss after that. I don't know, but this is my offer. I think that it would be a real first step toward this dry peace of which I am an advocate.
Okay, I'm gonna open it up in a minute for the audience. I would say that Prime Minister Netanyahu would probably think that that's what he has just done in the Knesset a couple of weeks ago, laying out his 8 principles upon which he would see a Palestinian state. You may not have liked his principles, but
no,
he did.
it's not that I didn't like them. Most of them are the principles that I represented in the negotiations room, but it's,
Right.
it was more of the deal breakers and less deal makers.
I see. There were the limits rather than the ways to move forward.
By the way, what you call peace, we call shelf agreement. The idea
Shelf
to reach
agreement.
an agreement and
then you take it off the
to
shelf.
implement it according to
Right.
the situation on the ground.
Peace and love.
Right. But okay, so I think for about a half an hour now, we'll take questions from the audience. There are mics on either aisle. So unfortunately, I guess you have to go line up at the mic to ask your question. And as Yossi said, try to make it as... sure, if you want to. You might know the troublemakers personally, right?
אני אשאל את השאלה בעברית. אנחנו היום עומדים בפני בעיה הכי גדולה. מה אנחנו צריכים לעשות? ואני שואל פה שני האורחים. במקרה ותהיה הפגנה המונית של עשרות מאות אלפים מול הגבולות שלנו. מתי נצטרך לפתוח באש? האם יהיה פה הרג, ואם יהיה הרג זה יגרום בטוח לקטסטרופה. מה הם מציעים כפתרון?
What is the possibility of
Yeah, you
the
need to
state
translate
of Israel
at least
when these
for,
demonstrations
Mr.
are going to
Lévy.
be against us, like in the Arab world, but between of Palestinians against on the Israeli borders or in the Israeli.
The question was, we are now facing a challenge that maybe thousands or perhaps even tens of thousands will march on our borders in defiance of the sovereignty of Israel, and this may pose a very serious challenge to us. What should be done?
Okay. I feel like it's maybe unfair to start with Mr. Lévy. Ms. Livni has been closer to these topics, so...
Okay, and maybe we are going, maybe, I don't know, hopefully not, but maybe we are going to see this kind of pictures next week. There is something
On
that
Sunday.
they call the, the Naksa Day, which relates to the 6 Days War, and so there are some plans, and Israel is making the right steps in order to prevent these from entering to Israel, but yet to avoid civil casualties, which is a formula that is quite complicated. But there's a need to make the right deterrence with people and not with weapons, which is basically, in big words, the formula.
Would you like to respond to it?
Demonstrations.
These are, the way it happened on Nakba Day in the middle of May, when people came from Syria, Lebanon, and tried to, and they're going to do it in larger numbers, in theory, on Sunday.
Before Arab Springs, should I remind us that we had something which was called Intifada, Intifada 1, Intifada 2, which were much worse than demonstrations. Which were more than a problem for Israel. Israel dealt with that more or less well. So it cannot be worse. If Arab Springs brings what you say, it will not be worse than
In a certain way, and I don't want to just to make the man's point, in a certain way, non-violent large numbers is a greater challenge for Israel. I mean, in a certain way, politically,
it is another sort of challenge, of course, but it is a democracy may have, I hope, the imagination to deal with that. You will have also in a few weeks, probably, a new fleet of boats arriving toward Gaza from Turkey, with some French militants from Region Rhône-Alpes and so on. We will have to deal with that again. I just hope it will be dealt better than the first time. I hope that there is now a real training in order to deal with this provocation, and so on. Of course. History will never be a path of roses. The Middle East will never be, and no area will be a paradise. In Europe, we believed that we had a sort of democratic paradise with a Europe built as a new space of prosperity forever. The space is breaking into pieces. We see the appearance of problems that we did never expect to see in our life. So all
You're
these
thinking of cucumbers in particular?
I'm sorry?
Cucumbers in particular?
All these sort of things can happen, of course.
Okay, is Yossi here still to ask? Okay.
My question is to Mr. Lévy. How do we choose between moral and realpolitik? Let's say that we are in September and we have elections in Egypt. And let's presume that the Muslim Brotherhood gained and win the majority places in the parliament. What will be your position? Will you accept the idea that the military regime in Egypt have to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood of taking the power in Egypt, like it happened in Algeria? Or we have to play the democratic game and let the Muslim Brotherhood win Egypt like the Hamas did in Gaza?
I had a stand in Algeria in 1992. I was favorable to the interruption of the process. The FIS and the GIA coming into power seemed to be opposite to democracy. I had the same feeling in Gaza. For me, it was a putsch. It was a coup, a democratic coup, but a coup. Hitler in 1933 was a coup, a democratic coup, but a coup. If Muslim brothers arrive in Egypt, I will not say democracy wants it, so let's democracy process. Of course not. Democracy, again, is not only elections, it is values. Barack Obama after Montesquieu. So you have to have the two. But my belief now, if you want my bet, and I take a risk saying that, my bet is that, again, I'm not an expert on Egypt, but as all of you, I try to look at what happens there. My bet is that the new atmosphere prevailing in Egypt will not be such a good wind for the Muslim brothers. I don't buy the theory which is expressed here and there that the Muslim brothers are the only organized force, that they are the only one able to take advantage of the situation. This is not my prediction. I may be wrong on that, but it's not my prediction. I believe that they will dilute themselves. In Libya, which I know a little better, I make a serious bet. I think that they are already the Muslim brothers which existed and which were the only underground opposition and built force to the regime of Kadhafi. They are really vanishing, they are splitting in front of this other force of opposition, which is democratic youth, wanting to make trade, wanting to exchange ideas, wanting to make business in Misrata and in Benghazi, wanting to have a normal life. I think that the Muslim Brothers, with their archaic, pre-fascist ideology, closing of the women, and so on, are more and more appearing as a force of the past, which is on the process of being put on the market.
But just to understand, you're saying that if they were to win a legitimate election, you would urge the military not to allow them to take power?
I will urge the prevention of them coming to power, but by all sorts of means. Yes.
According to the Universal Code.
According to what?
Yes.
To the Universal Code that I just offered.
Yes, of course. Well, I said that in Algeria, and I don't regret it. It opened a terrible period of disturbance, chaos, murders, and so on. But I believe that it would have been worse if we had let them coming in the power.
The good news is,
well, thank you to both of you to be here and to give us the opportunity.
Sorry, slicha.
Thank you to both of you to be here and to give us the opportunity to hear you. You are very dear to lots of people here in this country, both of you. A few days ago, Netanyahu gave a speech before the Congress in Washington, and he presented in a very clear way his politics and his vision of peace. It seems that he has not been heard anywhere. It seems that the voice of Israel is not heard anywhere, that only the narrative and the positions of Palestinians are heard in the media, especially in Europe, and more especially in France. How do you explain this?
Question is addressed to me?
Yes.
To
Two
both
of you.
No, I think it was for you.
No, it's for you. It's for you.
There is, okay.
And both of you.
What you represented now is the basic Israeli frustration, and I can share this because Israel is being misunderstood. There's a false perception of Israel. Nobody understands what Israel is. What is this Jewish state that we are asking the world to support? And basically there is misunderstanding whether Israel is a colonialist state that want to keep the entire territories, or Israel supports deeply the idea of two states for two peoples. I believe that it's not only about anti-Semitism and delegitimization of the state of Israel. We can change it, and in order to do so, there's a need for a new policy. And policy is not just great speech in the Congress and not just words. And as I said before, it relates also to the Israeli-Palestinian track. There's a need for trust. So when it comes to one speech or so, it's not going to change the perception that is there for many years now. And when we negotiated with the Palestinians it was 2.5 years ago, it was not a lot of years ago. And when we negotiated, the world supported the negotiations. They believed that, and rightly so, that Israel is serious enough. And simultaneously, we could act against Hamas in Gaza because they understood that when we act against terror, it's not against the Palestinians, but it's against the Palestinian terrorists, while we are serious enough and we understand what is the nature of the future agreement. And according to our understanding, the price of not having an agreement is higher than the price of making one. It is not clear yet, unfortunately, when it is represented by the current Israeli government. And maybe it's not only about who's making the speeches and who is the prime minister, but also what is the nature of the coalition that supports this.
Yeah, you don't disagree, right?
I don't.
Yeah.
I would say word after word what just was said.
Thank you.
My question is to Monsieur Henri Lévy. You were a strong supporter of the military actions that were taken by NATO in Libya. What is then your view of NATO taking similar actions in Syria?
Because you have to deal at the same time with idealism and realism, with hopefully politics and necessity and principle of reality. NATO, I suppose, I'm not a military specialist, but I'm sure that NATO cannot do everything. I'm sure that the French planes, which are at the limit of their capacity, can probably not be present on two theaters of operation. I believe that America, which is already involved in two wars, Iraq, a little still, Afghanistan, and now Libya, could hardly engage a fourth operation. So the chance, the luck of Bashar al-Assad is that the gangster Kadhafi was caught a few weeks before him. He was caught a few weeks before. My strong belief is that at least my position, if it had been the contrary, if Bashar al-Assad had begun to bomb his people beginning of February, I would have advocated an intervention exactly in the same way. And my feeling is that if I helped this intervention, as you said, I have the feeling that the words I used with my President Sarkozy, I think that they would have the same effect if it had been Libya or Syria. I think it would have been the same. So it is not a strange plot condemning Libya and favoring Syria. It is just a question of ability, pragmatism, chronology. The other thing I believe is that if the coalition, if the free world succeeds in Libya, it would be a very bad news for Assad, for the dictatorship in Syria, and it would be a little good news, late of course, but better late than never for the Syrian opposition, because it would be a warning. If Kadhafi, as I believe in the next days or weeks, is kicked out of the power, Bashar al-Assad will know that he is the next on the list. And politics is done like that. You cannot do all the desirable, the wishable, on the same day, in the same sequence of time, unfortunately.
And sanctions are a good start anyway. And sanctions are the beginning anyway.
Absolutely. And we have since a few days an improvement of sanctions, which were applied to a part of the gang of Assad and not to himself. All this is on the process of being corrected. A thing you know, of course, is that anyway, the world, the chancellors, the diplomacy, in general, they don't want nothing to move. If you had not the public opinions in France, for example, and in Israel, and in America, Kadhafi will still be there, quiet, bombing his people, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and so what, people? This is the way of reasoning of a lot, if not most, of the diplomacies of the world. Not all of them, of course, and the chiefs of state. Europe did not act, did not prevent the fascism in Spain in 1936, did not do anything against Munich in 1938, did not do anything in Hungary in 1956, did not do anything, did not defend its own values in Prague in 1968, and so on and so on, and not to speak with the Shoah and with the Armenian genocide. The democracies are very hard to defend their own values. This is a law. Sometimes you have a push of the public world consciousness who say enough is enough. This happened on Kadhafi. There was some images probably of the planes bombing the civilians demonstrating peacefully. It was felt as being unbearable. This would be, if it works, there would be a sort of jurisprudence, there will be a sort of precedent which will be opposable, which will be able to be opposed to other dictators like Bashar al-Assad. I don't think it is the oil, no. I don't think it is the oil for many reasons. Number one, Libya is not Iraq. No, I don't think so.
First question. In 2002, the Saudi Arabian gave a proposal that was approved by 22 countries, Arab countries, which was very logical. And one of the items there was not the right of return, but Resolution 194 of the United Nations in 1949, I think, which is not the right of return, it is a solution of the refugees problem. What do you think about this proposal to be active? This is the first question. Second, I wonder, there were two conditions that Netanyahu put on the table in the Congress and which was which were accepted fully, which I think are not reasonable. First of all, he declared that the West Bank is not an occupied area and we must have United Jerusalem. I don't think that in this case a peace can be achieved. I want your idea about it.
השאלה בשבילי, it's a question for me. You're asking me?
Whom are you asking?
Both of you.
Oh, okay.
Both of us.
Maybe you listen to me, you'll start. Is the West
Okay.
Bank occupied?
Relating to the Arab Peace Initiative, when it comes to the refugees, it is true that they relate to 194, but also said that there's a need for an agreed and just solution to this problem. My belief, and the only way to end the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is according to the understanding that 2 states for 2 people means that each and every state gives an answer to the national aspiration of its own people, Israel to the Jewish people and the future Palestinian state to the Palestinians wherever they are, those who live in the territories and those who are being kept as political cards in refugee camps, hoping for something that would never happen, because in the idea, according to the idea of 2 states for 2 peoples, Israel is not their homeland. Israel is homeland of the Jewish people, and the future Palestinian state is the answer for their national aspiration. By the way, the Palestinians, not only Palestinians, the entire world and also the Arab world understand my position, but nevertheless they wanted to negotiate it with me. So in the end, most of the Arab world, including the Palestinians, understand that the idea, those who want to end the conflict in accordance to 2 states for 2 peoples, understand that this is the basic. And also, in the past, we had this support coming from the United States by President Bush, saying that the creation of the Palestinian state is the answer to the refugee problem. And being honest, this is something that I promoted as a minister in Sharon's government with the United States. Because when you come to others saying it's not being pro-Israeli or anti-Palestine, it's being pro-peace. This is the only way to end the conflict. This is the concept. So you can be supported. Now, talking about West Bank, Judea and Samaria, you can call it this way or the other, it's not about who has more rights on the land. I believe in the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land. Judicial, biblical, historical, moral, all the rights. But it's not about who has more rights. It's about how can we shape a better future for our children. And by the way, in the negotiations room, at first, we were talking about rights, and I was talking about the Bible, and they were talking about their grandparents, and it was very interesting, but it was not helpful. And then we said, this decision, nobody needs to decide who has more rights. We decided that in order to keep, since our vision is not about the rights on the entire land, but our vision is about having a state which is the homeland of the Jewish people and the democracy, secured state in the land of Israel, but not on the entire land, because this is the only way to keep the values of the state of Israel. So this is part of the negotiations. It's not about whose narrative is a better one, whose narrative is going to win in the negotiations room, but an understanding that in the end we need to divide the land between Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea and to find an answer to all of the core issues, not just to postpone some to the future and to have some steps forward, to make the big decisions, the tough decisions, because this is the only way. In having a package, each and everyone can come to his own people and to say, okay, we took some risks, but calculated risks, we gave something, we are getting something, but we are going, this is, and it's written that this is the end of national claims between 2 sides, but also of Palestinians from Israel. I think that it's possible, but in order to do so, as I said before, there's a need to understand that doing nothing doesn't serve the interest of Israel.
Unless you violently disagree, I think we should move to the next.
I would like just to add that the 2-state, 2-people solution is a very bad solution for Israel, is a very bad solution for Palestinians, but that there is no better one, neither for those nor for this. That's the situation. Of course, the 2-state solution, the Israelis and the Jews will have to give up part of their dream. Of course, the Palestinians will have to give up part of their claims. Of course, there will be a balance of giving up this part and this part. but it is the only solution. And the opposite of that is not even war, it is hell. It is hell for your sons, for your grandsons, for the future generations.
It's the end of Zionism.
It is hell. End of Zionism, of course. Zionism which is not at all out of breath, but which will be out of breath if we have for another 10 or 20 or 30 years this situation in the West Bank with the moral corruption which it implies, and all the moral problems which it creates, and so on. So there is it is not the best. It is probably bad for everyone, but there is no other solution than the partition of the land. This I agree absolutely.
Okay, we'll do a couple more.
I'll have one thing, please.
Okay. Sir.
Yeah. I've spent the first 20 years of my life in Iraq. So I suppose I know a thing or two of what I'm talking about. I would like to assure Monsieur Lévy that the Arabs are not dumb. They have known for the last 60 years who their real enemies are. They are not Israel, they are their own leaders, they are their own people. They have known this, and if you go to their coffee shops and you listen to them in Arabic, you will know that exactly. They know exactly the situation, and they are not fooled by their leaders. It's very heartwarming to know that Libyan opposition leaders are not antagonistic to Israel. I would like to believe it when I hear it in Arabic, not in English and not in French and not in any other language.
He will only believe the friendliness to Israel when he hears it in
Arabic.
In English. Here.
In Arabic and not in English.
There's no Israeli-Palestinian problem or conflict. The conflict is Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arabs have been using the Palestinians to wage war by proxy on Israel. And Israel has walked into this trap very willingly and very stupidly.
So what's your question?
The question. Well, I would like, it was just a mind opener, and I would like to tell you that.
Question, you got to ask a question. Just raise your voice at the end and then sit down.
That the conflict, do you believe the conflict is about land, it's about refugees, or about Israel's right to exist? Because once this question is solved, there is no other, the conflict will disappear. Okay. And one last thing, in Arabic, the word compromise does not exist. Thank you.
I don't think that's true, but okay. Does either of you want to answer the question of whether it's about the existence of
a statement. It's a statement. So last question, because we have to leave the...
Okay.
We have to leave the hall.
No. One more question. I feel bad for the woman who's standing here. How about two more, this woman and this man? All right, we'll do it quickly.
Okay.
No statement this time, just a very short question. You are very well known for your moral clarity worldwide in Europe. I think I missed any remark from you on the very recent Abu Mazen statement of West Bank Judenfrei. It's very easy to demonize the Hamas. Rightfully so, Benjamin Netanyahu is attacked right and left. But very seldom we hear a word against Abu Mazen, which I believe is the Netanyahu of the Palestinians. What's your opinion about that?
About what?
Okay, so he's saying that Abu Mazen has wanted the West Bank to be entirely free of Jews. Is that what you said?
His terminology was Judenfrei in Arabic.
Well, anyway. And that it's easy to demonize Hamas, but people tend to be too nice to Mahmoud Abbas. What do you think?
You are probably right, but you have to have somebody with whom make peace. And you have to use what you have on the spot. You have Abu Mazen.
How can you make...
Who is not the worst? Who is not the best, again, but who is not the worst? Okay. I hope a peace with Abu Mazen. Then Abu Mazen will have to build a state. It will be a very hard work, a work which was done in this country by the pioneers and by their sons and grandsons. They will have to do that. They will be busy at building a state. I hope they will be helped from outside. I hope they will have intelligence enough to link with Israel in order to develop. And Abu Mazen will learn life, will learn about politics, and so on. And the principle of democracy is that the best is not in this world. The rule of democracy is at least the least bad.
But
this is democracy.
In Israel, unfortunately, most of us do think like Livni, but we vote Netanyahu. The Palestinians, however, on the other hand, they do, at the best case, believe like Abu Mazen that there should be a right of return. This is the consensus of the Palestinians.
The right to return shall be opposed, I hope, very strongly by the Prime Minister of Israel, whoever he or she is. It will be opposed, the right to return. It will be still in the current situation. You will have a majority of the powers in the world, at least the quartet, to endorse the Israeli position, and just to say that you cannot have two Palestinian states.
Okay.
That's all.
You know what is the problem? The problem is that what we see is a megaphone diplomacy. Netanyahu is calling the Palestinians to say this. The Palestinians are saying, telling us what is their position. I'm going to surprise you. In the negotiations room, we discussed what's going to be in the future with the settlements. So there were some ideas about whether Israelis can be there or not. It was an open issue. And by the way, for us, it's a completely different discussion because we need to ask ourselves whether we want Israelis to be there or are we, part of our responsibility as a government is to give them security, something which is going to be impossible in the future by the Israeli forces in the future Palestinian state. So the problem now is that you are going to quote Abu Mazen, and believe me, I don't like whatever he says about a lot of things. And they are quoting Netanyahu for what he says here and there. This is not the right way to move forward. I can see these two leaders standing in a kind of an iceberg. Both of them, they are talking one to each other, blaming the other, and the people are saying, great, he's a great leader, he's tough against the other. The icebergs are melting, and the ice is very cold, and we need to end this in the negotiations room.
Last question, please.
Is the panel not forgetting the reality on the ground that Hamas was elected to power in the Gaza Strip, and now they have joined with Abbas and Fatah on the West Bank? There is every likelihood that there's a possibility of them taking over as well in the West Bank.
For me?
And the question is?
In talking about the need for peace and then love, etc., etc., aren't you forgetting the reality on the ground?
No, we cannot.
Vis-a-vis Hamas.
No, of course we cannot. We live in a tough neighborhood. It's not going to be a new Middle East tomorrow morning, and as was said, first we are going to sign an agreement and then make peace. And part of this situation led us to an understanding with the legitimate Palestinian government that the Palestinian state would not be established on the ground when Hamas controls Gaza Strip. We have the conditions for the establishment of a state. Nobody is going to give the keys of the future Palestinian state to Hamas, but to the legitimate Palestinian government, and they don't want us to give the keys to Hamas, so it's a joint interest. So the idea, and it was agreed and supported by the entire international community, that at first we reach an agreement with the legitimate, with those who want to end the conflict, and then we are going to enter the second phase, an interim period of time, in which we are going to check realities on the ground, to check security, to see whether they are fighting terror or using terror against us, and only then the Palestinian state would be created on the ground. And this was agreed not only by the Palestinians, but by the entire world. But it works when Israel can work with the world and not just working against the world.
Just at one point, we are not living only in a tough area. We are living in a tough and difficult history. Not only this area has not the privilege of having some obscurantist forces or even fascist forces like Hamas and Hezbollah. Europe has had that with communism, with fascism. Latin America has had and still has with Chavez, some obscurantist forces. This is the destiny of mankind. We have a constant fight between democratic forces and obscurantist forces. This is what we have to deal with. This is what we have to fight in this area, like we did in Europe, like we did in other parts of the world. It is the deal. It is the deal. So to give the power to Hamas, of course not. To oppose in Iran the obscurantist forces of Ahmadinejad and so on, of course yes, and so on. This is the curse, the course and the curse of history.
We are at a university and that's filled with students, and not one student asked a question. We have a student who will pose the final question tonight.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Livni, you have said that Israel is necessarily a part of the free... You have said that necessarily, inherently, Israel is a part of the free, liberal world. And I wanted to ask you, and Lévy, is it necessarily so? Isn't there a possibility of an internal clash of civilizations in Israel between radicals and moderates? Because till now you've related to this issue only towards outside, towards the Arab world. But isn't there such a situation in Israel as well? Appreciate your
thank you. And I believe that the vision of the State of Israel about being homeland of the Jewish people and the democracy and having these values, living in harmony and not in contradiction, is part of the vision that need to be implemented also inside. And not just, we were talking about the Arab Spring, we are not talking about Israel. And my vision is not only about the need to make peace with the Palestinians, my vision about Israel as a Jewish or homeland of the Jewish people, and according to equality and the idea of having all the citizens in Israel having equal rights is not a favor to them, and it's not just because we are a democracy, but because this is part of our Jewish values as well. But I truly believe that the idea of two states for two peoples means that Israel, on one hand, is homeland of the Jewish people in terms of its symbols, the law of return that gives the possibility to any Jew to come and become an Israeli citizen, but yet each and every citizen, each and every individual, each and every human being, each and every citizen of the State of Israel is an equal rights citizen and should be treated like this. But it is true that unfortunately, because we didn't make the right decisions in accordance to this vision, we have amongst the Israeli society different societies living one near the other, speaking different languages. It can be Arabic or Hebrew or Yiddish, having a completely different vision with completely different values. And this is something that needs to be addressed in accordance to this vision by an Israeli government, but not only as a government, but leadership that acts in order to implement this internally as well.
Did you want to address that, Mr. Lévy? No?
I think it's okay.
Okay. So we thank you all very much. We thank our two guests.
תודה רבה לכם וערב טוב.
It was